The studio was buzzing with energy that afternoon. People in the audience were chatting, laughing, and settling into their seats. The familiar theme music started playing, and everyone knew what that meant. Steve Harvey was about to walk out, and another episode was about to begin. But today felt different somehow. There was something in the air that nobody could quite put their finger on. Steve came out with his usual confident stride, flashing that $1,000,000 smile that had made him a household name. He waved to the crowd, cracked a few jokes, and got everyone laughing within seconds. That's what he did best, making people feel comfortable, making them feel at home. The audience loved him for it, and that's why his show had become one of the most watched talk shows on television. After a few minutes of warm-up, Steve's tone shifted slightly. His smile remained, but there was something more serious in his eyes now. He looked directly at the camera and said he had a very special guest today, someone who didn't do many interviews, someone who preferred to stay out of the spotlight despite being one of the biggest movie stars in the world. The crowd leaned forward in their seats. Who could it be? When Steve said the name Keanu Reeves, the entire studio erupted. People jumped to their feet, screaming and clapping. It wasn't the usual celebrity excitement, though. It was something different. It was respect mixed with genuine affection. Because Keanu wasn't just any celebrity. He was the one actor that everyone seemed to love, not for his movies alone, but for who he was as a person. The side door opened, and there he was. Tall, dressed simply in dark jeans and a jacket, with that slightly awkward smile that made him seem more like your neighbor than a Hollywood superstar. Keanu walked across the stage, waving shyly at the roaring crowd. He seemed almost embarrassed by all the attention. When he reached Steve, they shook hands warmly, and Steve pulled him in for a quick hug. The two men sat down, and slowly, the audience settled back into their seats. Steve started with the easy stuff. He asked about Keanu's latest movie, about the stunts he did himself, about working with different directors. Keanu answered politely, thoughtfully, but you could tell these weren't the questions that really mattered to him. He'd answered them 1,000 times before. Steve knew it too. He was just warming up, building trust, creating a space where something real could happen. Then Steve shifted gears. He leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious, more genuine. He said something that caught everyone off guard. He told Keanu that he'd become famous on the internet, but not for the usual reasons celebrities go viral. Not for scandals or controversies or social media feuds. No, Keanu had become famous for being kind. The audience murmured in agreement. Everyone had seen the stories. The videos of Keanu giving up his seat on the subway to a woman with a heavy bag. The reports of him taking millions of dollars less in payment so that the special effects team and costume designers could get paid more. The stories of him stopping to help strangers on the side of the road. The pictures of him sitting on benches, eating lunch with homeless people, actually talking to them like they were human beings worth his time. Steve mentioned how there were entire social media pages dedicated to Keanu's acts of kindness. How people called him the most decent man in Hollywood. How young people looked up to him not because he played an action hero, but because he acted like a real hero in everyday life. With each example Steve gave, Keanu seemed to shrink a little in his seat. Not from pride, but from discomfort. He clearly didn't like being praised. He didn't do these things for recognition. Keanu smiled, a small, almost sad smile, and tried to brush it off. He said he was just being a normal person, doing what anyone would do. But Steve wasn't buying it, and neither was the audience. Because the truth was, not everyone did do these things. Most people didn't. Especially not people with Keanu's level of fame and wealth. They had assistants to handle things. They had security to keep people away. They lived in bubbles, separated from the reality most people faced every day. Steve leaned forward now, his elbows on his knees, his eyes locked on Keanu's. The mood in the studio shifted. The laughter was gone. This was becoming something else. Something more intimate, more real. Steve spoke softly, but his words carried weight. He said he'd been in this business a long time. He'd met thousands of celebrities, interviewed hundreds of them. And he could tell when someone was putting on an act and when someone was genuinely different. Keanu was different, Steve said. But difference like that doesn't just happen. Something shapes you. Something makes you who you are. The question hung in the air between them. What made Keanu this way? What created this level of humility and kindness in a world that usually encouraged the opposite? The audience was completely silent now. You could hear people breathing. Everyone was waiting for the answer. Keanu looked down at his hands for a moment. His jaw tightened slightly. You could see him deciding whether to go there, whether to open that door. Steve waited patiently, not pushing, just creating space. And then Keanu looked up, and there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something deeper. Something that carried weight and pain and hard-earned wisdom. He began to speak, and his voice was steady but softer now. He said that to understand who he was today, you had to understand where he came from. You had to understand what shaped him, what broke him, and what put him back together again. The audience leaned in, and so did Steve, because everyone in that room could sense it. Something important was about to be shared. Something real. Something that would help them understand not just Keanu Reeves, the actor, but Keanu, the human being who had walked through fire and somehow come out on the other side still believing in goodness. This wasn't going to be just another celebrity interview. This was going to be something people would remember. Something that would touch hearts and change perspectives. And it was only just beginning. Keanu took a deep breath and started talking about his childhood. Not the glamorous Hollywood version, but the real one. The one that shaped everything that came after. His voice was calm, but you could hear the weight behind every word. This wasn't rehearsed. This was lived experience being shared, maybe for the first time in such detail. He talked about his father first, how the man left when Keanu was only 3 years old, just walked away and never really came back. Keanu said he didn't remember much about him, just fragments. A voice maybe, a shadow in the doorway. But mostly what he remembered was the absence. The empty chair at dinner, the missing presence at school events, the questions from other kids about where his dad was and not having good answers. His mother did her best. Keanu made that clear. She worked hard, sometimes multiple jobs, trying to give her children a decent life. But it wasn't easy. They moved constantly. Keanu counted at least 5 different high schools. Every time they started to settle somewhere, started to make friends, started to feel like maybe this was home, they'd have to pack up and move again. Different city, different school, different faces, always being the new kid, always being the outsider. Steve nodded knowingly. He understood what it meant to struggle, to feel like you didn't quite belong anywhere. The audience was quiet, hanging on every word. This wasn't the story they expected from a movie star. This was something else, something more human. Keanu talked about how he found escape in sports, in acting, in anything that could take him out of his head for a while. He wasn't particularly good at school. He struggled with reading, with concentrating. Years later, he'd understand he had dyslexia, but back then he just felt stupid, felt different in a bad way. Acting became a refuge because he could be someone else for a while. Someone without problems, someone with a family that stayed together, someone who fit in. But then his voice changed when he started talking about his sister. Her name was Kim, and she was younger than him. Keanu's face softened when he mentioned her. You could see the love there, deep and pure. He said Kim was his best friend growing up. When everything else in their lives was chaos and uncertainty, they had each other. They protected each other. They understood each other in a way nobody else could. And then, when Keanu was starting to find success as an actor, when he was in his early 20s and things were finally looking up, Kim got sick. The diagnosis was leukemia, blood cancer. Keanu's voice got quieter when he said this. Steve reached over and put his hand on Keanu's arm, a simple gesture of support. The cameras caught it all. The audience felt the shift in energy. This was no longer just a story. This was real pain being shared. Keanu described what it was like watching his little sister fight for her life. She was a teenager when it started, with her whole life ahead of her. The treatments were brutal. Chemotherapy that made her sick, made her hair fall out, made her so weak she could barely lift her head some days. But she fought. God, she fought hard. And Keanu was there with her every step of the way. This was the late 80s and early 90s. Keanu was starting to become famous. He'd landed roles in movies. People were starting to recognize him on the street. But all of that meant nothing compared to what was happening with Kim. He'd film during the day, then rush to the hospital at night. He'd sit by her bedside reading to her, telling her stories about the movie sets, trying to make her laugh, trying to give her something to hold on to. The battle went on for 10 years. A decade of hospital rooms and medical procedures and hoping and praying. There were good days when it seemed like maybe she'd beat it, when she'd smile and joke like her old self. And there were terrible days when it seemed like they were losing her. Keanu said those years taught him something fundamental about life, about what really matters. He looked at Steve and then at the audience and said something that hit everyone hard. He said that all the success, all the money, all the fame, it was meaningless when someone you love is suffering. You'd trade it all in a second, every bit of it, for one more day with them, for one more moment where they're healthy and happy and whole. That's when you realize what wealth really is. It's not in a bank account. It's in the people you love and who love you back. Steve asked him how he balanced it all, how he kept working, kept building his career while dealing with something so heavy. Keanu said honestly, he didn't know if he balanced it well. He just survived, day by day, sometimes hour by hour. His work became both an escape and a source of guilt. He felt guilty being on set having fun while Kim was in a hospital bed. But he also needed the work to pay for her treatments, to make sure she had the best care possible. He talked about how Hollywood felt hollow during those years. He'd go to premieres and parties, smile for the cameras, do interviews where he had to pretend everything was fine. Then he'd leave and go straight to the hospital, back to reality. It created this split in him, the public Keanu and the private one, the guy in the action movies and the brother sitting by a hospital bed, helpless to fix the thing that mattered most. Keanu said Kim eventually went into remission. After 10 years of fighting, she beat it, and for a while life felt normal again, better than normal, because they'd been through hell and survived. They appreciated everything more. Small things became big things, a meal together, a walk outside, laughter that wasn't forced or covering up fear, just real, genuine joy at being alive. Those years with Kim, both the struggle and the victory, changed him completely. Keanu said he learned that life is fragile, that nothing is guaranteed, that you can't take people for granted because you never know how much time you have. It made him value human connection in a way he never had before. Made him see people differently. Everyone was fighting some kind of battle, visible or not. Everyone deserved kindness and respect. He looked at Steve and said something that stuck with everyone in that room. He said suffering doesn't make you special, but how you respond to it can make you better. You can let it harden you, make you bitter and angry at the world, or you can let it soften you, make you more understanding, more compassionate. Kim chose to keep fighting with grace. She never lost her sense of humor or her kindness even in the darkest moments. She taught him what real strength looked like. The audience was completely still. Some people were crying quietly. Steve himself had to blink back tears. This wasn't what anyone expected when they came to see a talk show that day. They thought they'd get some laughs, maybe hear some fun Hollywood stories. Instead, they were getting something much more valuable. They were getting truth. Raw, honest, painful truth about loss and love and finding meaning in suffering. Keanu paused, taking a moment to collect himself. Steve didn't rush him. Nobody rushed him. They all understood that what was being shared here mattered. It was important. And there was clearly more to the story. The way Keanu looked, the weight he still carried, everyone could sense that the hardest parts were still to come. But for now, they sat with what had been said. They felt the weight of it. And they waited together for whatever came next. Steve gave Keanu a moment before asking the next question. Everyone in the studio could feel what was coming. There was something heavier still, something that Keanu had been building up to. Steve's voice was gentle when he spoke, asking Keanu to share what happened next only if he felt comfortable doing so. Keanu nodded slowly. He looked down at his hands, then back up at Steve. What he said next would explain everything. Why he lived the way he did, why he valued kindness so much, why material things meant so little to him. This was the heart of it all, the thing that changed him forever. He started talking about the late 90s. By this point, he was a massive star. The Matrix had come out and changed everything. He was at the top of Hollywood, one of the most recognizable faces in the world. On paper, his life looked perfect. Success, money, fame, everything people dream about. But his personal life was about to give him something he'd wanted for so long. Something real. Something that mattered more than any movie role ever could. He met someone, a woman who understood him, who saw past the celebrity and connected with the real person underneath. Her name was Jennifer, and they fell in love. Not the Hollywood version of love, but the real kind. The kind where you can be yourself completely, where you don't have to pretend or perform. Keanu's voice got softer when he talked about her. You could hear how much she meant to him even after all these years. They found out Jennifer was pregnant. Keanu said he'd never been happier in his entire life. After everything he'd been through with his sister, after all the loss and pain, this felt like a new beginning. A chance to build something beautiful. They were going to have a daughter. They'd already picked out her name. Ava. Ava Archer. Keanu's voice cracked slightly when he said the name. He described how they prepared for her arrival. Painting the nursery. Buying tiny clothes. Reading books about parenting. Making plans for the future. Keanu said he'd never felt more excited about anything. Not movie premieres, not awards, nothing compared to becoming a father. He was ready. They were ready. Everything was falling into place. The pregnancy progressed normally for months. Regular checkups showed everything was fine. They'd seen the ultrasound images, heard the heartbeat. She was real. Their daughter was coming. Keanu said he used to talk to Jennifer's belly, telling Ava about the world she was about to enter. All the things they'd do together. How much he already loved her. And then, just weeks before the due date, something went wrong. It was Christmas Eve, 1999. Jennifer went into labor, but something wasn't right. They rushed to the hospital. Keanu's voice dropped to almost a whisper as he described what happened next. The doctors worked frantically, but there was nothing they could do. Ava was stillborn. Their daughter, the child they'd loved and planned for and dreamed about, was gone before she ever took a breath. The studio was completely silent. You could see people in the audience with their hands over their mouths, tears streaming down their faces. Steve's eyes were red, his usual composure shaken. This was devastation on a level most people couldn't imagine. To be that close to joy, to have it right there in your hands and then have it taken away in an instant. Keanu described holding his daughter. How she looked perfect, like she was just sleeping. How he kept thinking she'd wake up, that this couldn't be real. But she didn't wake up. She never would. He said that moment broke something inside him that he didn't think could be fixed. Everything he thought he knew about life, about fairness, about how the world worked, it all fell apart. Christmas Eve, what should have been one of the happiest times of his life, became the darkest day he'd ever known. While other families were celebrating, opening presents, being together, he was holding his daughter's body, trying to understand how something so wrong could happen. Why her? Why them? What had they done to deserve this? The grief was overwhelming. Not just for Keanu, but for Jennifer too. They tried to support each other, tried to hold on, but the loss was too heavy. It affected everything. How do you move forward from something like that? How do you go back to normal life when nothing feels normal anymore? Every baby they saw, every pregnant woman, every child laughing in a park, it was a reminder of what they'd lost. Of what should have been. Keanu said their relationship couldn't survive the grief. They loved each other, but the pain was too much. It created distance between them that they couldn't bridge. They separated, both of them carrying wounds that weren't healing. He didn't blame Jennifer. How could he? They were both just trying to survive, trying to find a way to breathe again. For a while, Keanu said he went through the motions of living. He worked because he had to, because stopping would mean facing everything head-on. But inside, he was hollowed out. The joy was gone. Everything felt gray and meaningless. People saw him in movies, saw him smiling at events, and had no idea that behind it all, he was barely holding on. And then, in April 2001, just 18 months after losing Ava, Jennifer died in a car accident. Keanu's voice broke completely when he said this. Steve reached over and gripped his shoulder. Some people in the audience were sobbing openly now. This wasn't just tragedy. This was compounded loss on a scale that seemed almost impossible to bear. Jennifer had been at a party at someone's house. She left around dawn, driving home alone. Her vehicle went off the road and hit several parked cars. She wasn't wearing a seatbelt. The investigation showed she might have been on medication for depression. Keanu said he'd always wondered if the grief over Ava had been too much for her. If she'd lost her way trying to find a path forward after their daughter's death. In less than 2 years, Keanu had lost his daughter and the woman he loved. 2 people who represented his future, his hope, his chance at a normal family life. Gone. Both gone. He said that period of his life was the darkest place a human being could go. He didn't see the point of anything anymore. Success meant nothing. Money meant nothing. Fame was just noise. Everything that most people spent their lives chasing felt completely empty. He stopped leaving his house unless he had to. Stopped answering calls. Pushed people away. He said he was angry at God, at the universe, at whatever force controlled things. Why him? What cosmic joke was this? Other people got to have families. Other people got to be happy. Other people got to keep the ones they loved. But not him. He felt cursed. Like he wasn't meant to have those things. Like he was destined to be alone. There were days, Keanu admitted, when he didn't want to wake up. Days when the weight of everything felt too heavy to carry. He wasn't suicidal, he made that clear. But he also wasn't living. He was just existing. Moving through time, waiting for the pain to stop or at least become bearable. He understood why people gave up when things got this dark. He understood it completely because he was right there on that edge. Steve asked him, his voice thick with emotion, what kept him going. What pulled him back from that darkness? Keanu was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that shifted the entire energy in the room. He said grief became his teacher, not in some immediate way, but slowly over time. The pain forced him to understand things about life, about humanity, about meaning, that he never would have learned otherwise. The audience waited. Steve waited. Everyone wanted to know what came next. How do you climb out of a hole that deep? How do you find light when everything is darkness? Keanu looked up and there was something different in his eyes now. Not happiness exactly, but understanding, hard-won wisdom that only comes from walking through fire. And he was ready to share what he'd learned, what had saved him, what had given him a reason to keep going. Steve leaned forward, his question hanging in the air between them. How did you survive that? How did you come back from losing everything that mattered? The audience was completely focused on Keanu now, waiting for his answer. This was what everyone needed to hear. Not just the story of pain, but the story of what comes after. How do you rebuild when everything is broken? Keanu took his time answering. He said the change didn't happen overnight. There was no magic moment where everything suddenly made sense. It was gradual, like sunrise after the longest night. The first thing that started to shift was his understanding of grief itself. For so long he'd been fighting it, trying to push it away, angry that it existed. But slowly he realized that grief was just love with nowhere to go. He loved his daughter. He loved Jennifer. That love didn't disappear when they did. It had to go somewhere. He started thinking about all the other people in the world who'd lost someone. Parents who'd buried children. Partners who'd lost their other half. Friends who'd said goodbye too soon. Suddenly his pain wasn't unique or special. It was universal. Every single person on Earth either had experienced deep loss or would someday. Understanding that didn't make his grief smaller, but it made him feel less alone in it. Keanu said he started noticing people differently. Really seeing them. The woman behind the checkout counter at the grocery store. The guy pumping gas at the station. The kid skateboarding down the street. Everyone was carrying something. Everyone had a story, had pain, had struggles they were dealing with. And most of them were just trying to get through the day, same as him. That realization cracked something open inside him. He remembered being at a coffee shop one morning, barely functioning, just going through the motions of ordering. The young woman making his coffee smiled at him, said good morning, treated him like a regular person even though she probably recognized him. That simple kindness, that basic human decency meant more to him than she could ever know. It was a light in the darkness, a reminder that connection still existed, that small moments of warmth still mattered. That's when things started to change. Keanu said he began looking for opportunities to be that light for other people. Not in big, dramatic ways at first, just small things. Holding a door open, saying thank you and meaning it, actually listening when someone talked, making eye contact, acknowledging people's humanity instead of just walking past them like they were invisible. These tiny acts of kindness became his way of honoring Ava and Jennifer. If he couldn't share his love with them anymore, he could share it with the world. Steve asked about the famous story of Keanu riding the subway, giving up his seat to a woman with a heavy bag. Keanu smiled, a real smile this time. He said that wasn't planned or done for cameras. He was just a guy on a train who saw someone who needed to sit down. What's the big deal? But people filmed it, posted it online, acted like he'd done something incredible. He found that strange at first, then sad. Why was basic kindness considered unusual? When had we gotten to a point where helping someone was newsworthy? He started doing more. Keanu said when he made the Matrix sequels, he was being paid an enormous amount of money. More money than anyone could really need. He looked at the production, at all the people working so hard to make the movie great. and realized a lot of them were struggling. The special effects teams, the costume designers, the set builders. These were artists and craftspeople who deserved to be paid well for their work. So he gave away a huge chunk of his salary, millions of dollars, to make sure they got bonuses and better pay. It wasn't charity. It was fairness. They were making the movie possible. They should share in its success. People called him crazy. Agents and managers told him he was leaving money on the table. But Keanu didn't care. What was he going to do with all that money anyway? Buy a bigger house to feel empty in? Another car to drive alone? Money couldn't bring back who he'd lost. But it could make life better for people who were working hard and struggling. That felt like something worth doing. That felt like his wealth could actually matter. The motorcycle company came next. Keanu had always loved riding. It cleared his head, gave him a sense of freedom and control when everything else felt chaotic. He met some craftsmen who built custom motorcycles, and they became friends. Good people who loved what they did but were trying to make it in a tough industry. So Keanu invested, helped them expand, created jobs, not for the money or the prestige, but because he believed in them and what they were building. Steve mentioned the cancer foundation that Keanu had established. This was news to some people in the audience. They didn't know about it because Keanu had never put his name on it. He'd kept it private. Steve asked why, and Keanu's answer was simple and profound. He said his sister's battle with cancer taught him what those families go through, the medical bills that crush you, the treatments that cost everything, the fear that you can't give your loved one the care they need because you can't afford it. He didn't want any family to face that, so he set up a foundation that helped cover costs, funded research, supported patients. He didn't need his name attached to it. The work was what mattered, not the credit. This was the pattern of Keanu's life after loss. He'd taken his pain and transformed it into compassion. His grief had become a bridge connecting him to other people's suffering, and instead of turning away from that suffering, he moved toward it. He helped where he could, not for recognition or praise, but because it gave meaning to his own losses. If Ava and Jennifer's deaths could inspire him to make the world a little better, a little kinder, then maybe their lives continued through his actions. Steve's eyes were full of tears now. He said he'd interviewed hundreds of celebrities, but he'd never heard anything like this. This wasn't about fame or success or achievement. This was about becoming more human through suffering, about choosing compassion when you could have just as easily chosen bitterness, about finding purpose in the worst pain imaginable. Keanu said something then that hit everyone hard. He said that society teaches us to run from pain, to medicate it, distract ourselves from it, pretend it's not there. We're supposed to get over it and move on as quickly as possible, but what if we did the opposite? What if we sat with our pain, let it teach us, allowed it to break us open instead of breaking us down? That's where real growth happens. That's where we learn what it means to be fully alive. He talked about how shallow his life had been before the losses. He'd been focused on his career, on success, on the surface things. The tragedy stripped all that away and forced him to rebuild from the ground up. What did he actually value? What kind of person did he want to be? Not what Hollywood wanted him to be, not what fans expected, but who he genuinely wanted to be when he looked at himself in the mirror. The answer was simple. He wanted to be kind. He wanted to help. He wanted to leave people in places better than he found them. He wanted to honor the people he'd lost by being someone they'd be proud of. That became his compass. When he didn't know what to do, he asked himself what choice would make Ava proud if she'd lived. What would Jennifer think? That question guided him toward the light. Keanu looked at the audience, many of whom were crying openly now. He said that everyone in that room, everyone watching at home, would face loss, would face moments when life felt impossible, would have their hearts broken in ways they didn't think they could survive. That was guaranteed. Pain was part of the deal of being human. But so was resilience. So was the ability to transform suffering into something meaningful. So was the choice, always the choice, to let hardship make you better instead of bitter. The applause started slowly, just a few people, then grew until the entire studio was on their feet. But it wasn't the usual celebrity applause. This was different. This was people responding to truth, to courage, to someone brave enough to share their deepest wounds in the hope that it might help others carry theirs. Steve stood too, embracing Keanu. Both men holding on to each other like brothers who'd been through war together. And, in a way, they had. The applause slowly faded and people settled back into their seats. But the atmosphere in the studio had completely changed. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something sacred. A space where real truth had been spoken, where walls had come down, where everyone present had been reminded of what really matters in life. Steve wiped his eyes, took a breath, and looked at Keanu with deep respect. There was one more question that needed to be asked. Steve could feel it, and so could everyone watching. The interview had taken them through the darkness, through the loss, through the slow climb back to light. But now people needed to know what to do with all of this, how to take these lessons and apply them to their own lives, how to face their own struggles with the kind of grace and dignity Keanu had shown. Steve's voice was gentle but clear when he asked the final question. What would you say to someone who's in that dark place right now? Someone who just lost someone they love? Or who's facing something that feels impossible to survive? What would you tell them? Keanu was quiet for a moment. This wasn't a question he took lightly. He knew that somewhere, someone watching this was barely holding on. Someone had lost a child. Someone had lost their partner. Someone was in the middle of their darkest night and desperately needed to hear that morning was coming. The weight of that responsibility was visible on his face. When he finally spoke, he looked directly at the camera. Not at Steve, not at the studio audience, but straight into the lens, straight at the people at home who needed these words the most. His voice was steady but full of emotion, full of hard-earned wisdom, full of truth that could only come from someone who'd walked through hell and made it out the other side. He said first that grief is not something you get over. That's a lie society tells us. You don't get over losing someone you love. You learn to live with it. The pain becomes part of you, woven into who you are, and that's okay. That's not weakness. That's love refusing to die even when the person is gone. So stop trying to get over it and instead learn to carry it with grace. Second, he said that pain doesn't make you weaker. It makes you more human. Everyone wants to avoid suffering, wants to protect themselves from hurt. But suffering is what connects us all. It's the universal language. When you've been broken, you can recognize brokenness in others. You can offer compassion because you know what it feels like to need it. Your scars become maps that help you guide others through their own darkness. Third, and this seemed especially important to him, he said that how you respond to tragedy defines you more than the tragedy itself. Bad things happen to everyone. Loss is democratic. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor, famous or unknown, good or bad. Everyone faces it. But you get to choose what you do with it. You can let it destroy you, let it make you bitter and angry and closed off, or you can let it crack you open, make you softer, more understanding, more compassionate. That's your choice. That's your power. Keanu talked about how he could have easily become angry at the world after losing Ava and Jennifer, could have withdrawn completely, built walls, decided that caring about people only leads to pain, so why bother? Many people would have understood that response. But he realized that closing his heart would be like dying while still breathing. It would mean the tragedy won. It would mean his daughter and his love had died for nothing. Instead, he chose to stay open, to keep caring, to keep connecting, to let his losses remind him daily that life is precious and fragile and short, that every moment with people you love matters. That kindness isn't a luxury, it's essential. Every time he helps someone, every time he shows compassion, every time he treats another human being with dignity and respect, he's honoring Ava and Jennifer. He's saying their lives and their deaths meant something. They changed him, and through him, they touched the world. He looked at the camera with an intensity that made everyone watching lean in. He said that if you're in pain right now, if you've lost someone or if you're facing something that feels impossible, please hear this. Your life is not over. This is not the end of your story. It's a chapter, a painful, terrible chapter that you didn't ask for and don't deserve. But it's not the final chapter. There are pages still to be written. There is still beauty to be found. There is still meaning to be created. The grief will change shape over time. The first year is survival. You're just trying to make it through each day, each hour sometimes. That's okay. Do what you need to do to survive. But eventually, slowly, you'll start to notice things again. A sunset, a song, someone's laugh. Small things that remind you that life is still happening around you. Let those things in. Don't feel guilty for having moments of joy. The people you lost would want you to keep living, really living, not just existing. Keanu said that everyone walking around has invisible wounds. The person who cut you off in traffic might have just left the hospital. The cashier who seems rude might be dealing with things you can't imagine. the coworker whose distant might be barely holding on. We're all fighting battles nobody sees, so be kind, be patient, be understanding, not because people deserve it, but because everyone needs it, because you know what it's like to need it. He talked about how helping others became his lifeline when he was drowning in his own pain. Reaching out to help someone else gave him something to hold on to. It reminded him that he still had purpose, that he could still make a difference, that his presence in the world still mattered. So if you're struggling, find someone who needs help and help them. Walk someone's dog, buy someone's coffee, listen to someone who needs to talk. Small acts of service pull you out of yourself and remind you that you're part of something bigger. Steve asked about regrets, about things Keanu wished he'd done differently. Keanu thought about it and said honestly, he wished he'd talked more openly about his pain earlier. He'd kept it private for so long, thinking that was strength. But silence around grief only makes it heavier. Sharing it, being honest about it, letting people in, that's actually what helps. Not just for you, but for everyone who's going through something similar and feels alone in it. That's why he agreed to do this interview, even though it was hard. Even though talking about Ava and Jennifer still hurt after all these years, because somewhere someone needed to hear that survival was possible, that you could lose everything and still find reasons to wake up, to try, to care, that broken people could still be beautiful people, that your worst moments didn't have to define your entire life. Keanu's voice got stronger now. He said that life is going to hurt you. That's non-negotiable. Love is risk. Caring is risk. Opening your heart is risk. And yes, sometimes the worst happens. Sometimes you lose people before you're ready. Sometimes things fall apart in ways you can't control. But the alternative is living with your heart closed, never really connecting, never really loving. Just existing safely behind walls. And that's not living. That's just a different kind of death. He looked at the audience, at Steve, at the cameras, and his final words were simple but powerful. He said that he'd held his daughter's body in his arms. He'd lost the woman he loved. He'd faced depths of pain that most people hopefully would never have to face. And he was still here, still trying, still believing that kindness matters, that love matters, that being human and vulnerable and open matters. If he could keep going after that, then anyone could keep going after anything. The message was clear. You are stronger than you think. Your pain is valid, but it's not your whole story. There is life after loss. There is meaning after tragedy. There is light after darkness. You just have to keep walking, keep breathing, keep showing up. One day, 1 hour, 1 moment at a time. And eventually, maybe not today or tomorrow or next month, but eventually you'll realize you're not just surviving anymore. You're living again. The studio erupted. People were standing, crying, clapping. Some just standing there with their hands over their hearts, too moved to do anything else. Steve pulled Keanu into a long embrace, and when they separated, both men's faces were wet with tears. The cameras caught it all. The raw emotion, the truth, the courage it took to be this vulnerable on television. This wasn't a typical celebrity interview. This was a moment that would be remembered. Clipped and shared, watched by millions. Not because it was dramatic or scandalous, but because it was real. Because it reminded people that behind fame and success and public personas, we're all just humans trying to make sense of pain and find reasons to keep going. We're all just trying to love and be loved, to matter, to make our brief time here count for something. As the show ended and Keanu left the stage, something had shifted. For everyone who watched, something had changed. They'd been reminded of what really matters. They'd seen what grace under pressure looks like. They'd learned that suffering can either destroy you or remake you into something stronger, more compassionate, more fully human. The choice is yours. And somewhere, someone watching who was in their darkest moment felt a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could survive this too. Maybe their story wasn't over either. Maybe there was still a future worth fighting for. That's the gift Keanu gave that day. Not just his story, but permission for others to keep writing theirs.